All right. We'll go ahead and we will start with our next presentation, Ag Emergencies, Disasters, Disease, and Downstream Consequences. Dr. Sarah Bailey, if you're here, could you please turn on your camera and we'll get started.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
And am I in presentation mode?
Yep, seems to be working for me.
Fantastic. And good morning, everyone. And a big thank you to the Department of Health for the invitation to participate in this year's event. I am really sorry to stand between the coffee and lunch, and I am a little concerned this presentation might diminish some appetites for bunny chow. If you were able to watch the presentation on cannabis and environmental contaminants yesterday, Dr. Max Lung did a really nice job of introducing the One Health concept. And I hope this session will also highlight the very complicated interaction between the environment, including weather, plants, animals, humans, and the effects of our actions to contain disease and respond to natural and technological disasters. Mr. Eulig was supposed to be co-presenting with me today, but is currently deployed with our veterinary technician. So you are stuck listening to me the whole time. Earlier this morning, we heard from a multi-agency panel on food emergencies, and what we're going to cover now are several scenarios of animal disease and plant pest outbreaks in what I consider to be two different buckets. Those diseases and invasive species like Ebola or cotton boll weevil that of themselves are an emergency. And then there are those diseases and pest translocation events, such as strep zooepidemicus or kitty distemper or pine bark beetles that occur as a result of disaster response. And then finally, I want to highlight some consequences of emergency management activities that impact our shared environment. I do want to also recognize that disasters have significant impacts on communities, especially those that depend on agriculture for employment. And there can be direct effects on farm workers, ranchers, veterinarians, animal health technicians, and first responders. And out of recognition that what we deal with can be pretty awful, and with the disclaimer that my slides do contain accurate depictions of diseases and disaster situations, this would be the time for some of you maybe to enter listen only mode or maybe go refill your coffee or get an early lunch. But with that, let's get started. It's hurricane season again. Almost 20 years ago, Hurricane Katrina made landfall along the Gulf Coast as a Category 4 hurricane. And it was the most destructive and the most costly natural disaster in US history. Experienced similar to what we're seeing today, supply chain disruptions, widespread crop damage. And at that time, millions of chickens and thousands of pigs died due to power outages and flooding. Other livestock evacuations were complicated by damage to transportation infrastructure because roads and bridges were washed out, and we experienced widespread animal feed shortages. The storm displaced people and animals, and rescue organizations relocated more than 5,000 pets and horses, although the true number is not known. But along with those human and animal movements, along went infectious diseases and parasites and plant pests. And it was those challenges experienced by animal owners and rescue workers during this response that led to landmark legislation called the PETS Act, or Pet Evacuation and Transportation Standards Act of 2006. That is why Hurricane Katrina is a landmark event in animal health emergency management. This PETS Act now authorizes FEMA to not only provide rescue, care, and shelter and support the essential needs for owners of pets, but also provide those same services to the household pets and service animals that go along with those people. This map outlines the origin and destination of about 3,000 dogs that had been documented to move from that greater New Orleans area during and immediately after the hurricane. And what we found out is that approximately half of those relocated dogs and a smaller proportion of cats in this retrospective veterinary study had heartworm infection when they were relocated. This result is pretty consistent with reports of a prevalence between 45 and 50% heartworm infection in dogs in that Gulf Coast region. And a similar study found that about 67% of dogs who were rescued following Hurricane Floyd were infected. And that was in also North Carolina in 1999. One of the challenges is that commercially available heartworm antigen tests don't detect infection of those animals until about 5 or 7 months after exposure. So these animals were infected, but not yet detected prior to relocation because of Katrina. And a similar study was conducted on horses with diseases that were endemic in that tropical Gulf Coast region, and also found a sharp increase in respiratory disease and new parasites in areas that were previously not known to be affected. These early season heavy rainfall events are almost always associated with increased local disease transmission to both humans and animals from mosquitoes due to that increased vector habitat as well as loss of housing for animals and people, which also increases their exposure. So West Nile disease incidence in birds, humans, and horses doubled in the impacted areas after Hurricane Katrina. Other examples of severe weather events impacting disease outbreaks include a large outbreak of vesicular stomatitis virus. This virus infects horses, livestock, and people. And what we found is that biting insects were blown in on the winds of Pacific tropical storms. They brought vesicular stomatitis virus from the south up to the west coast in Baja California. And the biting midges, coupled with that warm, wet spring, led to an outbreak of disease in horses and cattle beginning in May that lasted through August. And because this particular vesicular stomatitis virus causes clinical disease that is indistinguishable from a much more serious foot and mouth disease virus, the response to this required a resource-intensive response by animal health officials and did end up in the implementation of quarantines and interstate movement restrictions. And ironically, it was the arrival of Hurricane Hillary year that actually disrupted the outbreak through flooding and high winds. But then as things started to dry out again, the flies and the midges returned, and a second wave of viral infections occurred from October through early January of 2024. On the plant side, a classic example when a series of tropical storms created something like an atmospheric highway, allowed spores that cause a soybean rust to travel first to South America, where this pathogen is not native, and then Hurricane Ivan blew the fungus up into Florida. So switching gears a little bit, the State of New Mexico Environment Department published a news release, which was followed closely by a Dairy Herd Management magazine article in May of 2022 that outlined how PFAS contaminated groundwater from Cannon Air Force Base had unfortunately migrated off-site and resulted in the contamination of thousands of cows at Highland Dairy. Testing of these animals and their milk showed that products contained PFAS at levels that the U.S. Food and Drug Administration deemed unsafe for human consumption. So as a result, the owner of this dairy was unable to sell products from the farm and was ultimately forced to humanely euthanize about 3,600 cows or their entire herd under direction of the state veterinarian and New Mexico Livestock Board. The current estimated cost of this loss of revenue and increased expenses is estimated at about $6 million and doesn't include or account for upcoming costs associated with on-farm composting of animal mortalities and the final disposal of that biomass. Other things we worry about: in November of 2017, the first detection of an invasive Asian longhorned tick was reported on a sheep farm in New Jersey. Active surveillance for that invasive tick initially revealed infestations in multiple East Coast states. And a review of tick submissions in the National Archives indicated that the tick probably entered the US in or before 2010, probably on domestic pets or horses or possibly with people. Of note, female ticks of this kind can reproduce without a male, producing more than 1,000 eggs at a time without mating, meaning it only takes a single tick to create a population in a new location. Each of those infested animals could host hundreds to thousands of ticks, causing significant physiological stress, reduced growth or production, and a severe infestation can kill livestock from excessive blood loss as those ticks feed. In July 2016, the Florida Keys experienced a New World screwworm outbreak that killed more than 130 endangered key deer. Current theory is that the fly maggots were first introduced into the Keys through boat landings, and then the maggots and flies were translocated from the Keys to the Florida mainland, probably by pet dogs traveling with their owners. Unfortunately, after it took 12 to 16 months to eradicate this screwworm from mainland, just a few months ago in June, Costa Rica now announced the first human death and 7 confirmed cases of maggot infestation in humans, which is the first detection since the 1990s. And more importantly, last week, New World screwworm was confirmed in Guatemala, which hasn't seen a case of screwworm in over 30 years. And the entire southern continent and Central America has gone on high alert. This parasite is not only transmitted by flies and pets, it can also hitch a ride on human travelers, migratory wildlife, and movements of livestock. On the screen, you should see the emerald ash borer, hard to find in and amongst the bark. Gypsy moth, which actually the moth is not what's a challenge, but the caterpillar can damage foliage. Mountain pine beetles or bark beetles, and then also on the slide is that soybean rust I mentioned earlier, as well as the bottom right is an Asian longhorned beetle, which is not to be confused by the Asian longhorned tick, so similar names. What's interesting is that all of these pests increase during drought. The Asian longhorned beetle, or ALB, is native to China and Korea and currently poses a pretty serious threat to the United States, both urban and forest trees. Sadly, the ALB was first discovered in the United States in 1996 on Long Island, New York, and there have been 6 infestations of ALB in the United States, 4 of which are still ongoing. 2 of the infestations were successfully eradicated, but the challenge is that ALB can be transported in untreated wood products like wood packing materials or firewood. And so it's vital to be aware of the geographic locations of this insect and what the materials of risk are, and to immediately report anything suspicious to local authorities. And while it appears threatening, the beetle is pretty harmless to humans and pets, but we're going to come back to plant pests in a minute. In addition to screwworm and longhorn ticks, this is the trifecta that truly keeps me up at night. So these are the viruses or boogeymen that veterinarians and regulatory officials have nightmares about and really should scare the pants off of anyone who cares for livestock. And I do want to be clear that ASF or African swine fever, CSF, which is classical swine fever, and FMD, which is foot and mouth disease, they are not public health concerns and they do not pose food safety issues. These viruses will cause food security issues, though, and will cause significant food supply chain disruptions, a disaster of itself. And I really can't emphasize enough that if ASF ever gets here, or if CSF or FMD ever return, the outcomes of any detection will be economically devastating. Regardless of the pest or pestilence, there are consistent response activities that must be considered in every single one of these outbreak types and should be included on every response plan or preparedness effort. And those of you from public health or food safety, with the exception of number 13, where I might substitute mortality management for euthanasia and substitute mental health for animal welfare, each and every one of these concepts from the agriculture and animal health world should look pretty familiar. 3 of these activities, 13, 14, and 15 on this list, are the ones that we most focus on from a One Health perspective because these activities have unique environmental concerns. Depending on the situation and depending on the species and the number of impacted animals, the American Veterinary Medical Association provides guidelines to the USDA and FDA to follow in any action that might require humane endings of animals. And there is a huge misunderstanding by the general public and even within the animal health industry on the difference between euthanasia, humane slaughter, and depopulation. In a nutshell, euthanasia literally translates to a good death, and this typically involves a single owned pet. Humane slaughter is the term that is used specifically for animals intended as food, and I don't particularly like that term because it evokes images of humans hacking at each other with battle axes and broadswords. But in reality, humane slaughter, when it's done correctly, according to regulations, is as good a death for that food animal as the euthanasia of a pet. The difference is what you can use. Anesthetic overdose is the preferred method for companion animal euthanasia, but those animals are strictly prohibited from entering the food supply or rendering. Animals euthanized with any anesthetic or chemical agent also have to be buried or cremated according to local rules and ordinances to protect the environment and further exposure of wildlife to accidental contamination with those agents. Whereas methods that we use for humane slaughter of animals intended for food also have to protect fur or feather or specified risk materials like neurologic tissue from contaminating the end product. So there are pretty significant differences in the methods we are allowed to use for either euthanasia or slaughter. But really, when we talk about depopulation in the terms of emergency management and animal health situations, depopulation is the term reserved for the rapid elimination of very large numbers or entire populations of animals in a particular location or a production system. And the methods have to be fast, economical, effective, and humane. There are standards of time to death to meet, and veterinary oversight is required of any and all of the methods allowed for depopulation for both welfare reasons and disease containment reasons. Depopulation methods are also only used on animals that are already prohibited from entering the food supply, whether that's due to disability or disease. Some of the preferred methods include containerized or whole barn CO2 gas or nitrogen gas delivery, Gunshot is allowed if performed by a trained and permitted individual. Otherwise, captive bolt or electrocution can be employed, but typically is limited to smaller groups of animals. Just like cervical dislocation, it's pretty limited when you have to apply that method to a large number of animals. So we started to use small bubble foam applications or large bubble gas delivery using large bubble foam to basically distribute either CO2 or nitrogen gas in animals kept in captivity. I want to acknowledge that the image on the screen is not going to be allowed in the United States, but unfortunately, this is an example of what happened in Southeast Asia in response to an African swine fever outbreak that eventually wiped out about 40 to 60% of China's pig inventory. And just more than 1 million pigs were infected and had to be disposed of in 2021 alone. And unfortunately, that outbreak continues. Following depopulation or any animal mortality, mass mortality following a natural disaster does require appropriate disposal of that biomass. It's the cause of the mass mortality event or the method that was chosen for depopulation that significantly impacts the appropriateness of our disposal options. But quite frankly, the environment and the density of other at-risk animals or any susceptible plants in proximity to these locations is what drives which method of disposal is selected. Environmental impacts are a key factor in which options are allowed to be used in any given disaster or disease response. And in that upper picture, it's an example of a typical disposal pit for hogs that might have died just for natural causes on farm. And I learned the hard way that digging even a small hole in parts of Arizona can be a monumental task. So if I told you that the average commercial pig barn today can hold between 2,500 to 3,000 sows, each of which weighs between 500 to 650 pounds, you would need to dig a hole big enough to accommodate 500 to 700 tons of biomass per barn of pigs in a disease or disaster incident, and most farms have multiple barns on site. Composting of carcasses, as depicted in that bottom left picture, composting of not just the carcasses, but poultry litter, manure, and contaminated feed is a great way to eliminate viruses. And composting has become the standard by which we eliminate or remove avian influenza virus from the landscape. When we talk about composting, despite the fact that it is the current gold standard, first, I want you to think about how many truckloads of wood chips or straw or corn stovers you would need to effectively compost 700 tons of animal biomass. And then I want you to think back to that slide of the trees infected or infested with emerald ash borer or the gypsy moth caterpillar or those pine beetles, and then calculate the odds of our ability to detect those bugs in a semi-load of pulpwood before it was transported halfway across the state or across state lines. There's a nice short paper on the risk of introducing and spreading invasive species in a major disaster. It just came out earlier this year, and I'll try to put a link in the chat after the talk if anyone's interested. But that paper reports a surprising statistic that in the US alone, the economic costs of damage from invasive species is increasing 30% faster than the rate of damage costs incurred from all other natural hazards combined. The federal government spent $3.6 billion in 2022 alone to combat invasive pests. By comparison, the influenza response from 2022 to date is estimated at only, and I say only, $2.5 million to $3 billion, so much less than the invasive species effort. And the highly pathogenic avian influenza response has had to take into consideration using alternative carbon sources for composting, which might be more expensive or less readily available in areas where those poultry are infected. And so having to prevent moving emerald ash borer while dealing with avian influenza outbreak does get a little complicated. The last thing I'd like to mention on disposal is that historically, burning of carcasses has been used to respond to anthrax outbreaks and other certain viral diseases. And pre-planting and post-harvest stubble burning has also been used to eliminate plant pathogens and weeds. But the impacts of burning don't just include air pollution and water pollution or the risk of fires spreading out. There are also recognized long-term health consequences and mental health concerns for the workers and residents and witnesses of those pyres or field firings. And based on the lessons that we learned from the UK's multiple foot and mouth disease outbreaks, it is incredibly unlikely that the US would ever resort to using mass burning of infected carcasses in response to that disease. I call this my soapbox slide, and the pun is intended. And I'm hopefully preaching to the choir here, but here's my soapbox speech. The terms sanitation, sterilization, and disinfection are not interchangeable. So sanitation, sterilization, and disinfection do all refer to methods of reducing or eliminating microorganisms, but there are differences in scope or degree of effectiveness. So in any animal or plant disease response, we always talk about C and D. Clean and dry, or cleaning and disinfection. And you can't do clean or dry or clean or disinfection. It does have to be both. Cleaning, as you all know, removes the dust and the dirt and the residues from surfaces. It is absolutely required in every situation, every time. Disinfection means killing both bacteria and inactivating viruses on surfaces. Whereas sterilization is the process that eliminates everything. So sterilization is needed for surgery. For those of you in food handling, we refer to sanitation, which technically only refers to removing or reducing bacteria to a safe level. So we don't sterilize, sanitize in ag, we disinfect. And then when we talk about drying, what we're usually talking about is an exposure time to UV treatments or heat treatments or dry chemical disinfection, as opposed to a wet disinfection with a pesticide, viralcide, or bactericidal product, which is also left to quote unquote dry. But regardless of the method, all disinfection processes need to be evaluated for effectiveness through environmental testing to prove effective pathogen elimination. And there are standards in place for those applicators of some disinfectants to make sure that they're used appropriately and don't contribute to additional downstream consequences. In addition to time, other factors in decontamination processes do have to take into account ambient temperature, relative humidities, the hardiness of the pathogen itself, the quality of the water that is used for the cleaning, environmental pHs. Surprisingly, salinity actually does play a factor too. And then, of course, the surface of the structure you're trying to decontaminate. And if the surface is a dirt field or a manure pit, it's going to take a very large amount of chemical or nutrient to change a pH or a salinity. In the old days, we talked about adding lime or using vinegar or some other stronger acid or alkaline agent to help reduce pathogen load. But unfortunately, the size and structure of commercial agriculture facilities these days kind of negates most of those options. Hopefully, you are all aware of the ongoing outbreak of highly pathogenic avian influenza in the US and globally. Rolling pandemics of influenza impact migratory birds, which inevitably interact with game birds or domestic poultry and waterfowl. And some of those impacts of animal diseases on the public health include zoonotic disease transmission, the risk of actually having people infected with whatever disease they're working to combat. We do worry about worker safety, the correct use and fit of personal protective equipment, and the environment in which that equipment is used, the physical and the mental toll of conducting depopulation and disposal missions. And for the farmers themselves, disasters and diseases impacts not only their livelihood with the toll of the loss of the animals in their care or the loss of the family farm that might have been in that family for generations, that loss can be devastating. There's a lot of efforts in all the big agricultural states along the lines of supporting mental health in rural areas. The Arizona State Health and County Public Health Services have developed programs and outreach. Colorado Department of Health has created something called the Legacy video and some support programs, and I'll try and post that link in the chat after this talk too. I would encourage you to watch that YouTube video as it highlights some of the unique challenges that our agriculturalists who operate in remote and rural areas do encounter. And the Kansas Farm Bureau has created advocate awards to shed some light on some of these really complicated issues. So what's next on the horizon as far as agricultural emergencies, and where are we focusing our actions and mitigations and preparedness? Extreme weather events are increasing in frequency and intensity across the country and globally. There have been widespread droughts, widespread floodings, and more intense and more frequent severe storms in places that didn't experience these phenomena before. Many of you will be aware back in July of 2022, the level of Lake Mead was only 1,040 feet, which was the lowest level since 1937 when that reservoir was initially filled. So the water availability and water quality is really becoming a key focus area. Around the same time that the level of Lake Mead was at its lowest, we were seeing sudden spikes in temperatures. In June, the temperature rose so quickly in Kansas in 2022, it unfortunately resulted in the death of more than 2,000 feedlot animals in under a week because of the rapid change in temperature. Those animals didn't have an opportunity to acclimate to those sudden changes. Heat stress doesn't just happen to people. Heat stress significantly impacts cattle and especially pigs. And just heat stress alone can contribute to infertility, negative energy balances, just poor gain, poor doing, as well as increased mortality and increased susceptibility to diseases. You'll see decreased milk production and increased costs of production. Increasing environmental temperatures also increase insect reproduction rates, especially for some of those zoonotic disease threats like EEE and West Nile virus, and does increase the metabolic rate of things like harmful algal blooms, which was mentioned this morning, and some plant toxins that can impact companion animals as well as grazing animals and increase the risk with hurricanes and typhoons, again, with that standing water or wet conditions. The only good thing about fires, in my opinions, is that it can take out ticks and tick habitats. But beyond that, in addition to physical losses and psychological losses, fires also contribute to mudslides and erosions and are associated with anthrax outbreaks. Disease outbreaks do seem to be a natural sequela to disasters. And as I mentioned, FEMA does not yet recognize infectious diseases as a hazard, but our state departments of emergency services do. Smoke inhalation also leaves people and animals more susceptible to those opportunistic bacteria and fungal organisms and some viruses. And not just fire, but floodwaters contaminated with sewage or agricultural runoff and chemicals can lead to diseases and dysentery, as well as any disaster that displaces people and animals from their normal shelter are more likely to encounter those mosquitoes and ticks and flies and fleas. So pest control does become imperative. Animal barns are at risk from extreme wind events, including a series of tornadoes that were as experienced by Oklahoma beginning in 2023. And earlier this year, back in May, Will Rogers Downs in Oklahoma City took a direct hit from an EF3 tornado. And according to that executive director of the Thoroughbred Racing Association, the barn at Will Rogers can fit about 640 horses. Luckily, by the time that storm hit on a Sunday evening, all but one of the barns had been evacuated, and miraculously, only one of those horses had to be euthanized following traumatic injuries. Only 5 had to be transported to Oklahoma State University. But you can imagine, with widespread tornadoes impacting animals that are congregated, it can be a pretty big challenge to respond to. And lastly, some disasters are not caused by extreme weather events. We also have technological threats in addition to natural hazards that are on the rise. And only relatively recently, food and agriculture have become a target. May 30th of 2021, many of you will have remembered JBS, which is the Brazil-based meat processing company, suffered a cyber attack, and it disabled its beef and pork slaughterhouses. The attack impacted facilities, not just the United States, but also Canada and Australia. And as some of you might remember from COVID, when the processing plants are closed for any reason, it does back up some of those production systems that might result in culling or changes in production because those animals, if you continue to feed them, continue to grow, and we end up with welfare issues. We also had another notable shutdown in Pennsylvania, which had a beef facility and the largest facility east of Chicago. And then in 2023, another ransomware attack forced Dole to temporarily shut down production plants in North America and halt some food shipments to grocery stores. That cyber attack cost about $10.5 million in direct cost, but about half the cost related to trying to continue operations. And the cyber attacks complicate an already challenging situation, since some of these production systems are also trying to distance themselves or recover from unrelated recalls of ready-to-eat salads or other products that have been identified with either E. coli or salmonella. So a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and just confusion coupled with these attacks can be pretty impactful on the US economy and on consumer confidence. In 2024 alone, cyber attacks have targeted government-operated water systems, impacting water delivery and water treatment plants to residents, from commercial billings to actual disruptions of services. And right now it's estimated that there's about 150,000 public water systems in the US at risk, which are really important to our animal production and food processing systems. So an attack on the systems that control flood irrigation or dam management on the Colorado River would be catastrophic, not just from drought or flood impacts, but also the limitations on animal agriculture production. And despite all of these challenges, the US continues to have the safest food supply in the world because of everyone participating in this conference and other people like you who continue to support these highly efficient production systems. Those of you that provide robust regulatory oversight and provide continuous real-time monitoring that allows us early detection and rapid response to diseases or disturbances. So I do give you a heartfelt thank you to our audience for all that you do to help us prevent, detect, and respond to some of these disasters and disease outbreaks on the agriculture side. And with that, I think I will stop there and stand for any questions or any comments.
Awesome. We do have a couple of questions. We'll go ahead and pull those up. What is the largest emergency that you've been involved with in AZ?
So I should have started out this discussion with the caveat that I've only just relocated to Arizona about a year ago. I've had this position in other states. So since I have been in Arizona, some of the largest outbreaks we've dealt with are actually in horses, as far as equine infectious anemia traces, as well as the ongoing vesicular stomatitis detections, because anything that looks suspicious, we do have to treat as a potential threat. And then companion animals, we do occasionally see minor outbreaks of strep zoo in this state. And then there was recently a detection of a single fruit fly that was an invasive species that caused quite a lot of consternation and did require a lot of resources to ensure that it was just that one fly and that we didn't have any establishment of that pest here in Arizona.
Awesome. Next one is, how is vaccine hesitancy impacting this?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. And ever since a lot of people went home to COVID and adopted not just companion animals, but also started backyard chicken flocks or became, maybe a little bit more curious about vaccination technology in general. Any disruption of the supply of veterinary medicine also has downstream consequences to the diseases we're trying to mitigate or prevent. So we have not necessarily vaccine hesitancy, but just a lack of availability or lack of access to vaccines. We do know causes increases in the risk of rabies, which unfortunately is pretty endemic. We see that a lot in Arizona, as well as canine infectious respiratory disease outbreaks. Many of you might remember about a year ago, there was this concern that we might have a novel or emerging disease called, undifferentiated or some sort of infectious disease in dogs. And really what we found in the cases that we were able to follow up with, it was your vaccine preventable diseases like canine influenza or Bordetella or those other organisms that cause kennel cough that were really contributing to the spread of some of those infections. So we do certainly see impacts, and not just on the small animal side, on the livestock side. When people weren't going anywhere and doing anything over COVID, stopped vaccinating horses. And so we have seen probably attributed to the sort of interruption of vaccine provisions. We're seeing West Nile again in our horse populations, as well as some other vaccine preventable diseases. So it's a great question, and unfortunately, whether it's hesitancy or just lack of access to veterinary care, we have seen some outbreaks, not just in Arizona, but nationally.
From this morning's panel on the RRT, how would emergency management at ADA be involved with other teams or departments?
Yeah, great question. And again, it's sort of a unique situation that Jill Miller mentioned this morning, where the rapid response team is actually in a Department of Agriculture rather than the traditional Department of Health. There are a couple of public health veterinarians in Arizona, and we tend to crosswalk a lot of these discussions. And I personally work for food, so I'm pretty happy that we have these teams who are able to rapidly respond to detections before they become full-blown food emergencies. But how we in Ag Emergency Management would specifically support rapid response teams is supporting training as well as supporting the infrastructure, the coordination or communication between agencies that might be asked for additional resources, just providing that framework by which we use either an incident command system or other national incident management structures to support those efforts. And then as far as infectious diseases themselves or the contaminants or adulterants that might be involved, connecting those technical experts and subject matter experts across a variety of agencies is kind of what we do on a day-to-day basis. I don't know everything, but I do know somebody who might know an answer to a question on botulism or blue-green algae. So mostly what we do is that coordination aspect.
What is the largest global event that affected livestock?
Right now, African swine fever is continuing to march across the globe. We've been monitoring outbreaks that were first detected in Southeast Asia well back in 2017, 2018, and with very, very rare and small exceptions, once African swine fever gets into a country, it has not been able to be eradicated, mostly because of the movements of people and transportation of both legal and illegal movements of pork and pork products. Once African swine fever gets into a country, it's really hard to eradicate it. Also because of the feral swine populations, if it were ever to get into the United States, you can imagine with millions and millions of feral hogs and very, very limited tools in our toolbox to deal with those populations, it continues to be heartburn for those of us who also see that it's occurring in places in the world where there are already food insecurity issues. And so when you have countries and cultures that are dependent on pork for protein, and this disease wipes out a lot of those animals as well as the response to those infections, it's been pretty devastating and so far pretty concerning that we have so limited tools to respond to that event.
What should Arizona look for as a result of the hurricanes in Tennessee and Florida?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we always are reliant upon our public and our partners to let us know if they see anything unusual. So if you've been here for a while, unlike me, and you kind of know what's normal for Arizona, and you're starting to see things that aren't normal, kind of if you see something, say something to authorities would be really, really helpful. So those vector-borne diseases, some of the animal translocation events, people bringing their pets and other animals with them, plants and relocating. We're always on the lookout for those anomalies. And so honestly, hurricanes, they always come with surprises. So it could be anything, but if you see something that's a bit odd and you haven't seen it in the state before, probably not a bad idea to say anything. And we would typically just do our routine investigations, whether that's a plant challenge or an animal challenge or even a human public health anomaly. It's better to say something and have it be nothing than to be the one that didn't say anything and it got missed. So really, it could be anything.
Why are horses and dog getting ill important? And in the USA, we do not consume the meat of these animals. Why is this important to the economy and or public health?
Oh, that is a good question. And apparently I didn't do a very good job of explaining it. So horses and dogs travel and they travel with people, but they also travel with stuff. And so dogs that are being imported from Southeast Asia, they themselves might not be carriers or infected with African swine fever because that's just a disease or virus of pigs. But that virus is really hardy and can survive for a long period of time. So the concern with imported dogs for African swine fever would be that they bring the virus on bedding or they bring the virus virus in dog food, or they bring the virus on collars or other fomites. Same with horses. They just, because they move internationally for competition and because most people consider them companion animals as well as event animals, it's the stuff that they bring with them that we have a challenge. But I do want to highlight that it is those ticks that come with dogs and horses, or those larvae that can hitch a ride on dogs and horses. If they get into a livestock species that's susceptible, could be absolutely devastating to that agricultural community. So a dog that is bringing screwworm into the country could have a huge impact on cattle or sheep and goat productions. Hopefully that answers the question.
Is livestock and or horses inspected before they're transported into AZ?
They're supposed to be. And for anybody who's ever traveled out of state or across state lines or out of country knows that there's a requirement for a health certificate. And there were some changes recently to the importation of dogs specifically from certain areas with risk or with regard to the risk of importing rabies. And so those regulations are quite complicated and complex and are constantly changing. And there's multiple levels of regulations that do need to be met. So in addition to crossing our national borders through Canada and Mexico or air transportation. We also have interstate regulations that have to be met. So if you're going from California to Arizona or from New Mexico to Arizona, there's additional regulations too. But most states, most countries do require a veterinary inspection within some period of time, usually 7 to 10 to 30 days prior to moving any animal across a jurisdictional line. So inspections also do happen at our borders or interdiction stations, and there are agents who are trained to look for unusual activities. The dogs that are used by Customs and Border Control are amazing at the capability to sniff out or detect, vegetables or plants or pests, or even some infectious diseases before they are allowed into the country. So yes, there are lots of mitigations in place, but unfortunately, not everything is 100%. And we do have, very limited resources. And so we try to target those sea or air or land transports that come from the highest risk countries, focus our efforts there. But it does take everyone to stay vigilant and to, again, if you see something, say something to let us know, because the earlier we can find an introduction or earliest we can find a detection of something that isn't supposed to be here, the faster and cheaper it is to get out of that problem.
Are there any ongoing research or technological innovations being explored to improve disaster resilience in livestock and animal farming?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that is something I am not an expert in, but I am aware that there's a lot of work on heat stress and genetics, as well as susceptibility to certain environmental conditions. We do know that black cows just attract more heat, and so they suffer from more heat stress than other colored cows. We're looking at some things we can do to improve feed efficiency. We're looking at some production system changes so that we're not increasing metabolic rates through feeding. And for those of you who don't have a background in especially cattle production, that rumen or the fermentation system by which those cows take grass and turn it into protein creates a lot of heat. And so maybe just simple things like not feeding cows in the middle of the day, but feeding cows, later in the evening or even overnight, so that those heat production vats of rumination don't contribute to extra heat production during the peak of sunshine hours. But there is a lot of work to try and make our production systems a bit more resilient. We are looking at a more water conscious climate conscious agriculture. And if anybody has any brilliant ideas or funding streams for that research, please feel free to reach out.
And it looks like our last question here, do CAFOs have an impact on disease transmission?
Okay, and so for those of you who might not be familiar with that acronym, it's a confined animal feeding operation. Um, Yes, to some extent, although those production systems are managed a little bit differently, what I will say is that where we find the biggest risk of CAFOs is that you have a very, very, very large number of animals in a very small space. So they're actually more susceptible to natural disaster impacts. So again, if you think about, 100 cows grazing on 100 acres, the risk of one tornado impacting all of those animals, or the risk of a single exposure to anthrax is going to be a lot less of an impact than if you have that same tornado hit an area where you have hundreds to thousands of animals in a very, very small space. So we do see maybe a little bit of the disease impacts, but more importantly, they become a lot more there's a bigger risk with those natural disasters, having those animals all in one place. The other thing that we're having to deal with is because of changes in land use and land zoning, and just more people who need more room for urban expansions and to support those populations. We're having to produce as much, if not more, food and agricultural products on a lot less land. And so we talk about intensive farming practices. We truly do employ technology and precision agriculture to get the very, very most output out of as little inputs as we can these days. And those technologies that are employed in the confined animal feeding operations or those crop production systems are not only at risk from cyber threats, but just, the electrical grids and the internet. And we're having to do more with less. And so again, if anyone has some great solutions to feeding the world, all ears. So thanks for those questions.